Red Guardian. He's tough, he's buff, ish, and he sure does take a lot of guff. But the Red Guardian we saw in the MCU has more than a few differences from his red-finned comic book counterpart. The comedic comrade we fell in love with in the film is a far cry from the cold commie in the comics, so here's what the MCU changed and what they managed to kinda squeeze back into the suit. What the MCU got right are the legendary war hero elements of Alexei Shostakov. Originally debuting in Avengers 43, Red Guardian is a renowned World War II era Soviet pilot. They hint at this with the opening plane getaway, although Alexei isn't exactly in the cockpit, but the idea is there. He was publicly known in his home country for his heroics, which we also see with the Guardian action figures and the Russian fan mail. Fun fact, that's real Russian postage. The MCU obviously updates the timeline to align more with the Cold War than World War II, but kept the idea of the Russian mirror of Captain America intact. It's all a propaganda play for the hearts and minds of that country's citizens. Although in the comics, we don't see Red Guardian sent to jail, and there is no Dreykov turning his country against him. For the most part, the Red Guardian stayed loyal to his cause, but the betrayal and disillusionment after the end of the Cold War resonates with real Russian perspectives now. To quote Alexei, "Maybe I want to talk about the withering of the state, or maybe I don't like his hair or something and I say something casually about that. Maybe I want the party to feel actually like a party instead of this sourpuss organization, but instead, no. He puts me in prison for the rest of my life." While the MCU version is dealing with his past, much like Natasha is, more on that in a minute, in the comics, he was much more of a cold, unwavering, and brutal soldier. This modernization of the character might be why it actually rang true in our real-world Russia. In the daily newspaper Rossiskaya Gazeta, they wrote, "Alexei Shostakov, the Red Guardian, is a real Russian hero. He's a simple-minded, good-natured father who grumbles that his country has been destroyed, who tells tall tales, jokes inappropriately, and likes to drink, but, if necessary, will punish his enemies on behalf of his family, even if they're not real." So that seems positive, if not terrifying. Although, if you're actually Russian, you're probably used to the movie cliches of bleak outlooks, KGB spies, and drinking vodka straight from the bottle. As film critic Roman Kovalyov puts it, by now this sort of thing triggers more smiles than irritation. These tropes are very well established. They even have a word for it, klyukva, or cranberry cinema, which is great because in the earlier era of Marvel Comics, it's turned up to a 10 on the Soviet stereotypes. But some Russian audiences actually dug the MCU Red Guardian's bear of a man who loves his fake family. Which brings us to another of the big MCU comic departures, his relationship with Natasha. So there's a lot to love about the Red Guardian, but the biggest comic book change might be the fact that he was the most secret and super secret spies, that his own wife didn't know Alexei was the Red Guardian. Oh, and that wife was Natasha Romanoff. So there's that. Daddy Issues MCU strikes again. In the MCU, they kind of blended Alexei Shostakov and a father figure from the comics named Ivan Petrovich. Could that be the Father Ivan the Red Skull alluded to? Who cares? Anyways, Nat was a famous ballerina. He was a famous war hero. But once the government decided he would become Red Guardian, they were forced to separate, leaving the grief-stricken Nat to become a dark operative, hence Black Widow. Or just have a bunch of badass women in an evil organization and randomly name it after a spider. Sure, that works too. After Black Widow defected to the Avengers, they were tasked with taking on the Red Soldier, and of course, in true comic fashion, there was the big dun 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 when she realized the Red Guardian was her former lover. Nat was more like the mom, Melina Vostokov in the movie, who was also a villain named Iron Maiden, which is pretty metal. Then there's the whole storyline of Russian agents creating a life-sized model of Alexei, which they used to manipulate Nat into thinking he was still alive, to flip her again. Look, it could have all been a soap opera called Black Widow, Web of Lies. Keep in mind this was almost 60 years ago, so the MCU had to modernize the story to make it a little more relevant to today's audiences. And what did today's audiences love? Superpowered punching! The MCU was gracious enough to make Shostakov a superpowered, cap-like bearded brawler, but in the comics, he's mostly a product of training, much like Natasha Romanoff. It makes sense in the MCU since we know the Russians were developing a super soldier serum of their own with Bucky, but Shostakov was more like a pre-serum US agent, John Walker, just an exceptional, hardworking fellow with an affinity for bright-colored costumes. While we're on it, his costume stayed pretty true to form, minus the head fin, and with the usual added Marvel tactical accoutrement. However, one missing element was his belt, which had a boomerang-like disc he could detach and kind of hurl like Cap's shield. The MCU leaned more Russian Bear than Care Bear and axed the tummy-based projectile, but the way he handles Taskmaster's shield works just as well and kind of continues those Cap parallels. In the same way the Captain America mantle has been passed between different people, so too is the case with Red Guardian. To date, there have been 7 of them, with Alexei being the second and the most famous. Look, anytime they need a Russian baddie, they'll chuck him in a suit, but no one filled it out quite like Alexei Shostakov. Oh, and he took on the mantle of Ronin, just like Hawkeye. Oops, but we're out of time, folks, so we'll have to save that for another video. The essence of the Russian rogue seems intact in the MCU, so he's gotta come back, right? The fact that he takes the Ronin mantle could possibly bring the rotund Russian back in the Hawkeye series. Oh, and did I mention he also worked with Madame Hydra? Well, he did.